This is my true story. My son threw his shoe at me and hit me in the chest because I asked if we could take a short vacation together. I had raised him alone after his mother left, and I gave him everything I had so he could have a good life. But when I interrupted his phone call to ask about spending time together, he ripped off his shoe and threw it at my face while screaming at me to get out of his sight. I stood there humiliated in the house I had bought and foolishly put in his name. But you won't believe what I did next. Before I tell you what happened next, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe so more people hear this. I raised my son completely alone after his mother walked out on us when he was only 5 years old. She left a note saying she could not handle the responsibility of being a wife and mother anymore, and that she needed to find herself. She packed her bags and disappeared, and I never heard from her again. My son cried for weeks, asking where his mommy went and why she did not love him anymore. I held him every night and promised him I would never leave him and that I would be both mother and father to him for the rest of his life. I worked brutal hours to provide for us because I was the only income we had. I worked construction during the day and drove a taxi at night and picked up weekend shifts doing security at a warehouse. I would come home exhausted with my body aching and my eyes barely able to stay open, but I still made sure my son had dinner and help with his homework and someone to tuck him into bed. I slept maybe 4 hours a night for years because that was all the time I had between jobs and taking care of him. I skipped meals constantly so there would be enough food for my son. I would tell him I had already eaten or I was not hungry, but the truth was I could not afford to feed both of us properly. I wore the same clothes until they had holes in them because every dollar I saved went toward his clothes and his school supplies and his activities. I never bought anything for myself that was not absolutely necessary because his needs always came first. I made sure he went to good private schools even though the tuition was crushing me financially. I wanted him to have opportunities I never had and to be around kids whose parents were successful. I thought if he saw what success looked like, he would be motivated to achieve it himself. I paid for tutors when he struggled with subjects, and I paid for sports teams and music lessons and summer camps. I wanted him to be well-rounded and confident and prepared for life. I worked extra jobs to pay for his college education and made sure he graduated without any student loan debt. I did not want him starting his adult life buried under financial obligations the way I had been. I wanted him to be free to chase his dreams and build the life he wanted without being held back by money problems. I sacrificed everything to give him that freedom. I denied myself every comfort and every luxury so he could have a life of opportunity. I never went on vacation, and I never bought a new car, and I never ate at nice restaurants or did anything that cost money. My entire life revolved around working and saving and providing for my son. I had no hobbies and no social life and no time for myself because every minute of my day was dedicated to making sure he had everything he needed. I loved him with everything I had, and I believed that all my sacrifices would mean something to him when he got older. I believed he would look back and appreciate how hard I worked and how much I gave up for him. I believed that sacrifice would plant seeds of gratitude in his heart that would bloom when I got old and needed him. I thought he would want to take care of me the way I had taken care of him. I never asked him for anything while he was growing up. I never made him feel guilty about how much I was sacrificing or how hard I was working. I wanted him to have a happy childhood without the burden of knowing his father was struggling. I wanted him to feel secure and loved and free to just be a kid. I thought if I gave him unconditional love and support, he would naturally want to give that back to me when the time came. I believed my son would grow up to be a good man who understood the value of family and loyalty and gratitude. I believed he would remember everything I did for him and want to honor that by treating me with respect and kindness. I never imagined he would grow up to see me as a burden or an inconvenience or something he wanted to get rid of. As my son grew successful in his career, his tone toward me shifted from gratitude to contempt, and the change happened so gradually I did not realize it was happening until it was too late. He got a high-paying job at a tech company right out of college, and within a few years he was making more money than I had made in my entire life. He bought expensive clothes and ate at fancy restaurants, and started talking about investments and real estate like he was some kind of financial genius. He acted like he had achieved everything on his own through his intelligence and hard work. And he seemed to forget that I was the reason he had been able to go to college debt-free in the first place. He started calling me needy whenever I asked to spend time with him or wanted to talk about something important. If I called him during the week, he would sigh heavily and ask what I wanted in a tone that made it clear I was interrupting something more important. If I suggested we have dinner together, he would say he was too busy or he had plans with people from work. When I did manage to see him, he would spend the entire time on his phone, barely listening to anything I said. He made me feel like I was bothering him just by existing. He started rolling his eyes when I spoke, especially if I was giving him advice or sharing stories from my past. He would cut me off mid-sentence and say he had already heard that story 1,000 times, even when I knew I had never told him that particular story before. He treated everything I said like it was boring or stupid or not worth his time. He made me feel small and insignificant, like my thoughts and experiences did not matter, because I was just an old man who did not understand the modern world. He insulted me in front of his friends and colleagues and acted like it was just harmless teasing, but I could hear the cruelty beneath his words. He would make jokes about how I was old-fashioned or out of touch or technologically illiterate. He would laugh about how I still used a flip phone and drove an old car and wore clothes that were decades out of style. His friends would laugh along with him, and I would stand there humiliated, trying to smile like I was in on the joke when really I felt like I was being mocked and belittled. He mocked my age constantly and made me feel like being old was something shameful. He would comment on my gray hair and my wrinkles and the way I moved slowly because my joints hurt. He would say things like, "You are really showing your age," or "Maybe you should think about a nursing home soon." He said these things in a joking tone, but there was always an edge to his voice that told me he meant at least some of what he was saying. He made me feel like I was a burden simply for aging the way all humans age. I had bought a house years ago and foolishly put it in his name because I thought it would make estate planning easier and I wanted him to have security. I thought I was doing something generous and practical, but once his name was on the deed, he started treating the house like it was his property and I was just a guest living there. He would make decisions about the house without consulting me, and he would invite people over without asking if I minded. He acted like I should be grateful he was letting me live in his house, even though I was the one who had bought it with money I earned working multiple jobs. He made me feel small in the house I had purchased with decades of hard work and sacrifice. He would tell me where I could and could not go, and what rooms were off limits when he had guests. He complained about my belongings being in common areas and said I needed to keep my stuff confined to my bedroom. He treated me like an unwelcome roommate instead of his father who had given him everything. The disrespect was constant and grinding, and it wore me down until I started to believe maybe I really was just a burden taking up space in his life. One evening I gathered all my courage to ask my son if we could take a short vacation together, just the two of us. I had been thinking about it for weeks, and I knew he was always busy, but I hoped he might be willing to spare just 2 days to spend time with his father. I wanted to reconnect with him the way we used to when he was younger, before his career and his money and his new life had created this distance between us. I thought maybe if we got away from his work and his phone and all his distractions, we could talk and remember what it felt like to be family. I walked into the living room where he was sitting on the couch, talking on his phone. He was having what sounded like an important business call, and his face was serious and focused. I should have waited until he was finished, but I had been working up the courage to ask him for days, and I was afraid if I did not do it right, then I would lose my nerve. So I stood in the doorway and waited for a pause in his conversation, and when he took a breath, I said, "Excuse me, son, can I talk to you for just a minute?" He looked up at me with immediate irritation in his eyes and held up one finger telling me to wait. But I was already committed to asking, so I said I was wondering if maybe we could take a short vacation together, just 2 days. Maybe go to the beach or the mountains like we used to. I said it quietly and apologetically because I did not want to make him angry. But I could see his face changing as I spoke. His jaw clenched and his eyes narrowed, and I realized I had made a terrible mistake. He put his hand over the phone and hissed at me to get out and wait until he was done with his call. But before I could back out of the room, he suddenly stood up from the couch, and his whole body was rigid with rage. He told whoever was on the phone that he would call them back, and he hung up without waiting for a response. Then he turned to me with a fury I had never seen in him before, and he started yelling about how I had just interrupted an important business call that could have made him thousands of dollars. I tried to apologize and explain that I did not know it was that important, but he was not listening. He screamed that I was always bothering him and always needing something and always making his life harder. He said he was sick of me being in his house and in his way and ruining his opportunities. His face was red and his hands were shaking, and I could see genuine hatred in his eyes when he looked at me. I had never seen him like this before, and I was genuinely afraid of what he might do. Then he reached down and ripped off his shoe with such violence I thought he might hurt himself. He held it in his hand for a second, staring at me with pure contempt, and then he threw it directly at my face with all his strength. I flinched, and the shoe hit me in the chest instead of my face, and the impact knocked the breath out of me. He screamed, "Get out of my sight, you pathetic old man," while I stood there in shock, holding my chest where the shoe had hit me. The shoe fell to the floor between us, and we both stared at it like it was evidence of a crime. I looked at my son's face, expecting to see regret or horror at what he had just done, but instead, I saw satisfaction. He looked pleased with himself, like he had finally gotten to release all the frustration he had been holding in about having to deal with me. He did not apologize or try to take it back. He just stood there, breathing heavily, waiting for me to leave the room like he had commanded. I picked up the shoe from the floor and handed it back to him without saying a word. My hands were shaking, and I felt tears building up behind my eyes, but I refused to cry in front of him. I turned around and walked to my bedroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of my bed trying to process what had just happened. My chest hurt where the shoe had hit me, and my heart hurt even more because I could not believe my own son had just physically attacked me for asking to spend time with him. I sat on my bed for hours replaying what had just happened and trying to understand how my life had come to this point. The shoe had hit me hard enough to leave a red mark on my chest, and I could still feel the sting of the impact. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing my son genuinely hated me. He had not thrown that shoe in a moment of temporary anger. He had thrown it with the intention of hurting me because he wanted me to feel pain. He wanted me to know that I was worthless in his eyes and that he would rather assault me than spend 2 days on vacation with me. This was the same boy I had carried on my shoulders when he was tired during long walks. The same child I had rocked to sleep when he had nightmares about his mother leaving. The same son I had worked 3 jobs to support and sacrificed everything to give opportunities to. I had given him my entire life, and he had just thrown a shoe at my face and called me pathetic. I tried to understand where I had gone wrong as a parent and what I could have done differently to prevent him from becoming this cruel. I thought about all the times I had made excuses for his behavior and told myself he was just busy or stressed or going through a phase. I had convinced myself that deep down he still loved me and appreciated what I had done for him. But the truth was obvious now, and I could not deny it anymore. My son saw me as trash. He saw me as an obstacle in his life that he wished would disappear. He saw me as something disposable that had no value beyond what I could provide for him financially. That night, I could not sleep in my bedroom because it felt too close to where he was in the house. I went to the living room and lay down on the couch in the dark, staring at the ceiling and thinking about my future. I was 72 years old, and I had no wife and no other children, and my only son had just assaulted me in the house I had bought for him. I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life, including the day my wife left me with a 5-year-old child to raise by myself. I realized I had been living in denial for years, pretending that things were not as bad as they seemed. I had been clinging to the hope that someday my son would wake up and remember who I was and what I had done for him. I had been waiting for him to grow up and mature and develop empathy and gratitude. But he was 32 years old now, and he was not going to change. This was who he was, and I needed to accept that and decide what I was going to do about it. Around 3 in the morning, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I decided I was done sacrificing myself for someone who treated me like garbage. I decided I was done hoping for love and respect from someone who was incapable of giving it. I decided I was going to take back control of my life and my assets and make sure my son understood there were consequences for treating his father the way he had treated me. The decision felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. I got up from the couch and went to my bedroom and pulled out a locked box I kept hidden in my closet. Inside the box were documents related to accounts and investments my son knew nothing about. I had been quietly building wealth for decades in addition to what I spent supporting him. I had stocks and bonds and real estate investments that had grown substantially over the years. My portfolio was worth over $3 million, and according to my current will, all of it was going to my son when I died. I had never told him about this money because I wanted him to work hard and build his own success without relying on an inheritance. I wanted him to be independent and self-sufficient. But I had always planned to leave him financially secure so he would never have to struggle the way I struggled. That night, staring at those financial documents, I realized my son did not deserve a single dollar of what I had built. He had shown me exactly what kind of person he was, and I was going to show him what happens when you throw shoes at the man who gave you everything. My son lived in luxury and genuinely believed he had achieved everything through his own brilliance and hard work. He drove a BMW that he leased using an account I had set up for him years ago when he first started working. He thought the account was his employee benefit package, but really, I was the one funding it because his entry-level salary at the time had not been enough to cover the lifestyle he wanted. I had quietly supplemented his income for years without telling him because I wanted him to feel successful and confident. He threw lavish parties at the house and bought expensive furniture and electronics and never seemed to worry about money. He traveled to exotic locations for vacations and posted pictures on social media, showing off his sophisticated lifestyle. His friends thought he was incredibly successful, and he did nothing to correct that impression. He acted like he was a self-made man who had climbed the corporate ladder through talent and determination alone. He never mentioned that his father had paid for his education and given him a debt-free start in life. What he did not know was that I had been building wealth quietly for decades in accounts he had no knowledge of. After his mother left, I had become obsessed with financial security because I never wanted to be vulnerable or dependent on anyone again. I worked multiple jobs and lived on almost nothing and invested every spare dollar I could find. I bought stocks when the market crashed and held them for years until they recovered. I purchased small rental properties in neighborhoods that eventually gentrified and increased in value dramatically. I had taught myself about investing by reading library books and studying the financial section of newspapers. I made some mistakes early on, but I learned from them and got better at understanding markets and identifying opportunities. Over 30 years, I had built a portfolio worth over $3 million. The money was spread across various accounts and investments and trusts that my son had no access to and no knowledge of. I had kept it completely separate from the money I used to support him and pay for his education and lifestyle. My will designated him as the sole beneficiary of everything I owned. When I died, he would inherit the house that was in his name, plus all my investment accounts and properties and cash. He would become a wealthy man overnight and never have to work another day in his life if he did not want to. I had structured everything to avoid estate taxes and make the transfer as smooth as possible. I had spent hours with lawyers and financial advisors making sure my son would be taken care of after I was gone. I had planned to tell him about the money eventually, maybe when he got married or had children of his own. I wanted him to know that even though I lived modestly, I had been successful in my own way and that I had built something substantial to pass on to him. I imagined him being surprised and grateful and maybe finally understanding the full extent of what I had done for him. I thought the revelation of the inheritance would bring us closer together and make him see me as more than just a pathetic old man taking up space in his house. But now everything had changed. That shoe he threw at me had changed everything. I realized he did not deserve to inherit wealth he had done nothing to earn from a father he treated like trash. He thought I was a burden with nothing to offer and no value beyond my ability to stay out of his way. He had no idea that his entire future financial security depended on my generosity and that I had the power to take it all away with a single phone call to my lawyer. I thought about how satisfying it would be to watch his face when he finally understood what he had lost. I imagined him learning that the pathetic old man he threw a shoe at had been a millionaire all along and had chosen to give everything away rather than leave it to his ungrateful son. The thought of his shock and regret and desperation brought me a dark satisfaction I had never felt before. He wanted me gone from his life, and I was about to grant that wish in a way he would never forget. The morning after the shoe incident, I woke up on the couch with my chest still aching and my resolve stronger than it had been the night before. I had spent hours thinking about what I needed to do, and I knew there was no going back once I started. I waited until I heard my son leave for work, and then I went to my bedroom and found my lawyer's business card in my desk drawer. My hands were shaking as I dialed the number, but my voice was steady when the receptionist answered and I asked to speak with my attorney immediately. My lawyer had handled my estate planning for over 20 years, and he knew every detail of my financial situation. He knew about the investment accounts and the rental properties and the stocks and bonds I had accumulated. He had drafted my will years ago and updated it several times as my portfolio grew. When he got on the phone, I told him I needed to make emergency changes to all my documents and that I needed it done as quickly as possible. He could hear the urgency in my voice, and he asked if everything was all right. I told him everything was not all right and that my son had physically assaulted me in my own home. I explained how he had thrown a shoe at me for asking to spend time with him and how he had called me pathetic and told me to get out of his sight. My lawyer was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was very sorry that it happened and asked what I wanted to do. I told him exactly what I wanted, and I said it calmly and clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. Remove my son from everything I said, every account, every property deed, every stock certificate, every dollar. I want him removed as beneficiary from all of it. My lawyer asked if I was sure and reminded me that this was a major decision that would have permanent consequences. He said I should take some time to think about it and make sure I was not acting out of temporary anger that I might regret later. But I told him I had been thinking about it all night and I was absolutely certain. I said my son had shown me who he really was, and I believed him. I said I did not want a single penny of my money going to someone who treated me with such contempt and cruelty. I said I would rather give everything to charity than leave it to him. I instructed my lawyer to redirect all my assets to charitable organizations that helped elderly people who had been abused or abandoned by their families. I wanted my money to help people who were going through what I was going through. I wanted it to provide support and dignity to seniors whose children had discarded them. My lawyer started taking notes and said he would draft new documents immediately. Then I told him there was one more thing I needed him to do, and this was even more urgent than changing the will. I told him the house my son was living in was still legally in my name, even though I had been telling people for years that I had given it to him. I had put his name on some documents, but the deed was still in my name and I was still the legal owner. I asked my lawyer if that was correct, and he confirmed that yes, the property was still mine, and I had the right to do whatever I wanted with it. I told him I wanted my son evicted immediately, and I wanted it done through legal channels with police involvement if necessary. My lawyer was silent for a moment, and then he asked if I was really sure I wanted to throw my son out of his home. I corrected him and said it was not his home, it was my home, and I was done letting him live there rent-free while he treated me like garbage. I said I wanted eviction papers drawn up immediately, and I wanted law enforcement to serve them. I wanted my son to understand that actions have consequences, and that throwing shoes at your father comes with a price he could not afford to pay. 3 days later, I was sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks away from the house when my lawyer called to tell me the police were on their way to serve the eviction notice. He said everything had been processed quickly because I had provided documentation of the assault and the ownership papers were clear and indisputable. He said I should stay away from the property during the initial serving of the papers because my son might react badly and the situation could become dangerous. I agreed and waited at the coffee shop, nursing a cup of tea I could barely drink because my stomach was in knots. I knew my son would be home because it was Saturday morning and he usually slept late on weekends. I imagined him stumbling to the door in his bathrobe, annoyed at being woken up and expecting to see a delivery person or a neighbor. Instead, he would see police officers holding legal documents that would turn his entire world upside down. Part of me felt guilty for what I was about to do to him, but a larger part of me felt he deserved every bit of suffering that was coming his way. My lawyer called me 30 minutes later and said the papers had been served and that my son was in complete shock. He said the police reported that my son had initially refused to believe the documents were real and kept saying there must be some kind of mistake. The officers had to explain multiple times that the house was legally owned by his father and that he was being given 72 hours to vacate the premises. My son had apparently asked where his father was, and the police told him they were not authorized to share that information and that all communication needed to go through his lawyer. The lawyer said my son had started yelling about how this was his house and how he had lived there for years and how his father had given it to him. But the police showed him the deed with my name on it and explained that verbal promises do not constitute legal ownership. They told him he had 3 days to remove his belongings and that if he was not out by the deadline, they would return with a locksmith and physically remove him. My son had demanded to speak to me immediately, but the officers said that was not their responsibility and that he needed to handle this through legal channels. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness hearing this report. Satisfaction because my son was finally experiencing consequences for his cruelty. Sadness because it had come to this, and because the relationship with my only child was being destroyed in such a dramatic and painful way. But I reminded myself that he was the one who threw the shoe and called me pathetic and made me feel worthless in my own home. I was just finally standing up for myself and refusing to be a victim anymore. My lawyer said my son's face had drained of all color when he realized the eviction was real and legally binding. He said one of the officers reported that my son had stumbled backward and grabbed the doorframe to steady himself like he might faint. The reality was sinking in that the home he had treated as his personal kingdom for years had never actually belonged to him. The house he had ruled like a tyrant, throwing shoes at his elderly father, had been mine all along, and I was taking it back. The officer had explained calmly that my son had 72 hours starting from that moment to remove all his personal belongings and vacate the property. After that deadline passed, the locks would be changed and anything left inside would be considered abandoned. My son had asked what he was supposed to do and where he was supposed to go, and the officer had said that was not their concern and that he needed to figure it out. The police had done their job and left my son standing in the doorway of a house that was no longer his holding papers, that proved his entire life was built on his father's generosity, and that generosity had just been permanently revoked. Within hours of being served with the eviction papers, my son's lawyer called my lawyer begging for a meeting to discuss the situation. My son had apparently hired an attorney immediately after the police left and told him everything that had happened. His lawyer wanted to negotiate and find some kind of compromise that would allow my son to stay in the house, or at least give him more time to find another place to live. My lawyer told him there would be no negotiation and no extensions, and that the eviction would proceed exactly as planned. My son's lawyer tried a different approach and said that evicting my son was an extreme overreaction to a family disagreement. He said throwing a shoe might have been inappropriate, but it did not justify making someone homeless. He suggested that perhaps counseling or mediation would be a better solution than legal action. My lawyer responded by explaining that this was not just about the shoe incident, but about years of abuse and disrespect that had finally reached a breaking point. He said his client had made his decision, and it was final. Then my son's lawyer said something that made it clear my son still did not understand the full extent of what he had lost. He said that my son was willing to apologize and make amends, and that he hoped we could resolve this quickly so my son could get back to managing his inheritance and planning for his future financial security. Those words made my blood boil because they showed my son still thought he was entitled to my money even after everything he had done. He thought he could apologize his way out of consequences and still collect millions when I died. My lawyer paused and then delivered the news that would destroy my son's entire understanding of his future. He said, "I need to inform you that there is no inheritance anymore. My client has removed your client from his will entirely and redirected all assets to charitable organizations. Your client will receive nothing when his father passes away." There was complete silence on the other end of the phone for several seconds, and then my son's lawyer asked him to repeat what he had just said, because surely he must have misheard. My lawyer repeated it slowly and clearly. "Your client has been removed as beneficiary from all accounts, all properties, and all financial instruments. The estate, which is worth approximately $3 million, will be donated to charities supporting abused elderly people. Your client gets nothing." My son's lawyer started stammering and asking how that was possible and whether my son had known about this money. My lawyer explained that his client had built this wealth over decades and had kept it private and had intended to leave it to his son, but that plan had changed permanently. My son's lawyer said this was a huge mistake and that my son had no idea his father had that much money. He said, "If my son had known about the $3 million, he never would have treated me the way he did." My lawyer pointed out that this statement perfectly illustrated the problem and proved my client had made the right decision. He said the fact that my son only valued his father based on his net worth was exactly why he did not deserve the inheritance. He said my son had thrown a shoe at a man he thought was poor and worthless, and now he would learn that man had been wealthy all along and had chosen to give everything away rather than leave it to him. My son's lawyer tried to argue that I was not thinking clearly and that I was making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. He said families fight and say things they do not mean, and that destroying my son's financial future over one incident was disproportionate and cruel. My lawyer calmly informed him that his client had documentation of years of abuse, and that this was not about one incident, but about a pattern of behavior that had finally resulted in physical violence. He said the decisions had been made with full mental competency and had been carefully considered and would not be reversed. The call ended with my son's lawyer saying he needed to inform his client about the inheritance situation and that he would be in touch. My lawyer called me immediately after and told me everything that had been said. He asked one final time if I was absolutely certain I wanted to proceed. I said, "Yes, I am certain." He threw his shoe at me for asking for 2 days together, so I am throwing him out of my $3 million fortune and out of my life forever. Within a month of the eviction, my son's entire life fell apart in ways that were both predictable and devastating. He had to move out of the house within 72 hours as ordered, and he ended up renting a small apartment in a neighborhood that was a dramatic downgrade from what he had been living in. He could barely afford the rent because it turned out most of his lifestyle had been funded by accounts I had set up for him years ago, and I had closed all of those accounts the same day I changed my will. The BMW he drove was leased under one of my accounts, and when I canceled the account, the leasing company repossessed the car within 2 weeks. His credit cards had been tied to accounts I controlled, and when I shut those down, his cards were declined, and he racked up fees and penalties that destroyed his credit score. He had been living far beyond his actual salary for years without realizing it because I had been quietly subsidizing his lifestyle. Now that the subsidies were gone, he could not maintain the appearance of success he had built his identity around. He had to sell most of his expensive furniture and electronics just to pay his bills, and he quickly realized his actual income was not nearly enough to support the lifestyle he had been living. His friends vanished almost immediately once the money dried up. The people he had thrown lavish parties for and traveled with and bragged to about his success suddenly stopped returning his calls. They had been attracted to his wealth and his generosity and his connections, and when those things disappeared, so did they. He posted desperate messages on social media asking if anyone knew of job opportunities or had a couch he could crash on, and the responses were sparse and unhelpful. The friends who had laughed at his jokes about his pathetic old father were nowhere to be found when he actually needed help. His job performance suffered because he was distracted and stressed and angry about what had happened. His boss called him in for a meeting about his declining productivity and attitude problems. My son apparently broke down and told his boss everything about being evicted by his father and losing his inheritance and having his life fall apart. His boss was sympathetic, but said personal problems could not interfere with work, and that my son needed to get himself together or there would be consequences. My son tried to improve, but the damage was done, and 3 months later, he was let go from his job for performance issues. He called me dozens of times, begging for forgiveness and a second chance. I let every call go to voicemail. He sent text messages saying he was sorry and he did not understand how badly he had hurt me, and he would do anything to make it right. I blocked his number. He showed up at the coffee shop where I had been spending my mornings and tried to approach me, but I got up and walked out the back door before he could reach me. He sent emails promising he had changed and learned his lesson and would be a better son if I would just give him one more opportunity. I deleted them without reading past the first line. He sent a letter through his lawyer offering to go to therapy with me and work on our relationship. My lawyer responded that his client had no interest in reconciliation and that all communication should cease immediately. My son's lawyer called back saying my son was in desperate financial straits and was about to lose his apartment, and could I at least help him with rent for a few months while he got back on his feet. My lawyer said no and reminded them that my son had called me pathetic and thrown a shoe at my face and that he was reaping exactly what he had sown. The last I heard, my son had moved back in with his ex-girlfriend from college, who apparently took pity on him even though he had treated her badly when they broke up years ago. He was working at a retail job making minimum wage, trying to rebuild his life from nothing. He had gone from thinking he was a successful, self-made man with a multi-million-dollar inheritance waiting for him to being a 32-year-old, living with an ex-girlfriend and working retail. The fall had been swift and brutal and entirely his own fault. I moved to a quiet coastal town 3 months after evicting my son, and I have never been happier or more at peace. I rented a small cottage within walking distance of the beach, and I spend my mornings watching the sunrise over the ocean and my evenings reading books I never had time to read when I was working multiple jobs to support my ungrateful child. The town is full of retired people who mind their own business, and nobody knows about my past or my estranged son or the fortune I donated to charity. I am just another old man living simply and quietly and enjoying what time I have left. I donated the majority of my $3 million estate to organizations that help abandoned and abused elderly parents. I researched carefully and found charities that provide legal assistance to seniors whose children are trying to exploit them financially. I funded programs that offer counseling and support groups for elderly people struggling with family estrangement. I gave money to shelters that house seniors who have been kicked out by their own children or left homeless after being taken advantage of. Every dollar I spent brought me more satisfaction than leaving it to my son ever would have. I kept enough money for myself to live comfortably for the rest of my life without worrying about expenses. I do not live extravagantly, but I also do not deny myself basic comforts anymore. I eat at restaurants when I want to, and I buy books, and I take short trips to places I have always wanted to see. I finally bought myself a decent car and nice clothes, and I treat myself the way I should have been treating myself all along instead of sacrificing everything for someone who never appreciated it. My son sends letters to my lawyer's office, and they forward them to me unopened. I have a box full of envelopes I have never opened and never will. I do not need to read his apologies or his explanations or his justifications. Nothing he could say would change what happened or make me want him back in my life. He had decades to treat me with respect and kindness, and he chose cruelty instead. He threw a shoe at my face and called me pathetic, and now he gets to live with the consequences of that choice forever. He leaves voicemails on my lawyer's office phone, begging for just 5 minutes to talk to me and explain himself. My lawyer's assistant deletes them without listening to the full messages. He has tried to find me by searching for my name online and calling old friends and acquaintances, but I have covered my tracks well, and nobody knows where I moved to. I want to live out my remaining years without his voice or his presence or his demands intruding on my peace. He wanted a vacation from me, and I have given him a permanent vacation from my love and my money and my mercy. I have made friends in my new town with other people who understand what it is like to be discarded by family. We meet for coffee and go on walks together and share stories about our lives. Some of them have also been abandoned by their children, and we find comfort in knowing we are not alone. We do not spend much time dwelling on the past or feeling sorry for ourselves. We focus on enjoying the present and making the most of whatever time we have left. We have created our own chosen family based on mutual respect and genuine care for each other. I sleep well at night, knowing I finally stood up for myself and refused to be a victim anymore. I do not regret evicting my son or donating my fortune to charity instead of leaving it to him. I do not feel guilty about cutting him out of my life permanently. He treated me like trash, and I removed him from my life the same way you remove trash. He threw his shoe at me for asking for 2 days together, so I threw him out of my $3 million fortune and out of my life forever. And I would make the same choice again without hesitation, because some people do not deserve forgiveness, and some damage cannot be repaired, and some relationships are better ended than endured.